In this episode of Season 4's Focus on Leaders of Tomorrow, host Melanie Taddeo welcomes a man who embodies leadership in public service, the Honourable Steven Fletcher. Steven Fletcher is a former parliamentarian, having served as a Member of Parliament for the riding of Charleswood, St. James, Assiniboia in Winnipeg from 2004 to 2015. He later served one term as a member of the Manitoba Legislative Assembly. Having sat as an opposition member as well as a member of the National Cabinet under Prime Minister Stephen Harper, Steven Fletcher knows a thing or two about embracing a cause and promoting it, despite the odds. Enjoy this very special episode focusing on Leaders of Tomorrow. And be sure to check out the show notes in your podcast app to get all the website links to Steven Fletcher's past work, as well as his ongoing advocacy throughout Canada.
Good day and welcome to another episode of Connect for Life, the podcast. I'm your host, Melanie Taddeo, and I have the honor and privilege of interviewing another changemaker today, Honourable Steven Fletcher. Steven, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Melanie. Thank you.
So I always like to have our guests introduce themselves because that way we're getting it from the source. Can you tell us a bit about yourself and your background?
Well, I'm a Canadian. I grew up in Winnipeg, Manitoba. I became a quadriplegic after I hit a moose with my car when I was 23. I had just completed my engineering degree and was working in the mining industry. And in an instant, I went from having a great future, a strong foundation, was athletic, and then completely paralyzed from the neck down, and spent a long time on a ventilator just to learn how to breathe, and then very long time in the hospital, and then trying to reintegrate myself into society. And I went back to university after my accident and did my MBA at the University of Manitoba. And that opened up a lot of opportunities, and including an opportunity to run federally in the 2004 election, which I did, and I won, became a member of Parliament, and won four terms, and became a cabinet minister under Stephen Harper, and as far as I know, first wheelchair-bound person to be elected to a federal body, Parliament of Canada, and then a bunch of stuff in between and afterwards.
Well, thank you so much for sharing. And my goodness, what a journey it has been. Now, along that journey that you just shared with us, I think leadership comes into this in a big way. So, was there a defining moment going through all of this, whether it was prior to the accident or after, that kind of defined what type of leader or what would guide you in the area of leadership?
I wouldn't say that there was anything specific. I was a very outdoorsy person. I enjoyed wilderness canoeing and our great Canadian boreal forests and Canadian Shield. And anyone who goes wilderness canoeing will know that there's no point in complaining out in the middle of the wilderness, and you just got to get things done. And that's one of the approaches in my life, is just to get things done, have a goal and achieve it. And the goal can be very modest at the beginning. Simple breathing was a very big deal for me after my accident because I don't have the diaphragm or the proper breathing that I once did. So that was the first goal, is to relearn how to breathe, and then going back to school, relearning how to learn, and very incremental, infinitesimal steps, but also laying the foundation for future success in day-to-day living, and then living beyond, and trying to be a full participant in society. And that was a long process. And eventually, I was able to take some leadership roles. Education is super important. I found it very empowering. Go back and do my Master's of Business Administration. And I was able to take some leadership roles in university, became student union president for a couple of terms. A conservative elected in a left of center environment. The university is an interesting exercise and a learning experience. And it opens doors. And eventually got involved in federal politics. First with, and nothing was given. I had to fight for nominations. And first for the Canadian Alliance, the precursor to the Conservative Party. That was a contested nomination. And when the Conservative Party was formed, I had to, in a contested nomination there. And the seat I was running in was a very difficult seat, and against a very formidable opponent, a long-held Liberal seat. So there was a lot of risk, a lot of effort, and in the end, in a way, the more difficult path, the more rewarding the journey.
Absolutely. And I really like the fact that you said, leadership, it doesn't have to be in big chunks. It can be moderate. It could be something you work towards to get it done, whether it's education, and again, daily life. I love the fact that you use the example of breathing again, like learning to breathe on. And that is, really puts things in perspective, because I think sometimes when we think about, oh, I'm going to accomplish this big goal and become a leader, we think it's monumental. And breathing definitely after your accident would be monumental, but it doesn't have to be automatically right going into government, but using that journey and examples that you use. Thank you for illustrating that. But I am curious, what made you want to get into government?
Well, when I had my accident, I realized that on one hand, in our society, we save people from catastrophe, but then the resources to allow those people to live meaningful and dignified lives are not there. So part of what you were talking about with leadership is just taking control of my own life. And part of that was just to get out of the institution of hospitals or nursing homes, and which was where I was headed, to self-managed care and be able to select my own caregivers and select where I wanted to live rather than where the systems of the past wanted me to live. So taking a leadership role just in my own life. That empowerment was key. And then, as you say, step by step, it builds on each other, and then options and opportunities present themselves, and you have to seize those opportunities. But you also have to demonstrate that you are capable of fulfilling those opportunities. Like, I wasn't going to be trying out for the Winnipeg Jets hockey team. Like, I recognized my limitations and my strengths, and tried to pursue activities that allowed me to enhance and build on that. And it was tough, because things like canoeing and cross-country skiing and hiking weren't going to be a significant part of my life anymore. That was hard to take. So,
Absolutely. I think, I don't I really want to let us think about what you just said, because when you are going through life and you're enjoying all the things you love, and when something happens and takes that away from you, it is a huge adjustment. And not only mindset do we have to get in the right frame of mind, but then to kind of find out which direction to go in is a whole other journey. And identifying your strengths, I think, is such an important thing. And you did talk to the point that you were the first individual in a wheelchair that was elected to cabinet. What was that like? Did you face barriers and challenges? Was it uh, a difficult situation? And I love the fact of why you joined and decided to make the decision to run. But what was that like?
well, it was intimidating, I suppose, but maybe I didn't realize how intimidating it was. It was a goal. I felt I could do it. I had the education and the background that I thought I could make a contribution through lived experience, plus with a unique engineering business background. And using that as the basis, was able to speak to people and door knock. And the more I did that, the more people saw who I was and didn't look at my mode of transportation. Now, I have to give the credit to the people of my former riding, which is the West Winnipeg, Charleswood, St. James, Assiniboia, because they saw past, or didn't even really look at the disability, nor did I focus on it. I focused on what I could do to help the people in the riding to improve their lives. That's what the job of a member of parliament is. And that's what I did. And that's why I was elected 4 times in that role. And I was elected once eventually as well. And keeping that eye on what the actual goal in that role is, and that is to represent the people who vote for you. And
Definitely. Sorry, go ahead.
and there was some commentary. Like, I remember being on a local radio show, and they're saying, "Oh well, Stephen, you're running against this star liberal candidate, and it's handpicked by the Prime Minister to run that riding's long-held liberal riding. Why on earth, given your situation, why on earth would anyone vote for you, an unknown and in wheelchair, rather than this other person?" I said, "Well, I think the people of the riding would rather have a representative that was paralyzed from the neck down than the neck up."
Mhm.
And though a little edgy, and be no disrespect to the very capable opponent, but I wanted to make the point that I was running on what matters for that
Mhm.
position, which was the cognitive ability to represent the people of the body.
And that is definitely so important because, again, so many people see the disability, they don't see the abilities. So you definitely prove them right. And being reelected 4 times, that speaks volumes to what you were able to do for the riding and the impact you had as a member of parliament. Now, we know leadership kind of goes hand in hand with advocacy. So I'd like to talk a little bit about how you perceive advocacy, whether it's in government, in leadership, or even as an individual with disabilities.
Well, that's a great question, Melanie. Advocacy, I think first I had to get my own life together. So self advocacy, and that also meant issues around healthcare, home care, uh, auto insurance. And I found that my advocacy for myself also helped others in similar situations and learning a lot about how the systems work um, helped me to better understand what I could do to contribute. And then getting involved in politics, it's interesting. I didn't run on disability issues at all. In fact, I rarely talked about it, was very rarely asked about disability. And in my first brochure in the first election, you'd be very hard pressed to even be able to tell that I was in a wheelchair from the photos and so on. And I was sensitive because two people do make assumptions
Mhm.
about people on face value. We're all guilty of it. And so, again, best advocacy is to just to demonstrate. People were saying, well, how is he going to door knock? You know, um, well, I go door to door just like everyone else. And like every other campaign politician, I usually have someone with me to knock on the door, and it worked out. And how was he going to get to Ottawa? Well, like everyone else, in the West, they fly. We're not going to, I'm not going to walk to Ottawa, take the train. I'm going to take the same method as everyone else. And people just assume that that can't be done, but it actually can be done. And rather than having to explain it, I just did it. And people saw that. And I think that is almost the best kind of advocacy is for people with a disability to participate and to be seen participating. And that erases a lot of the stereotype in itself. And I have to give credit to uh, the people who elected me, but also to my parliamentary colleagues from across party lines, particularly to Stephen Harper, because at the time, there was no one in my situation in Parliament or ever Parliament. And so he allowed me to run, but I had to demonstrate that I could run by winning the nominations. And then, so he was like, okay, the guy can win the nominations, um, let it run. And then he gave me some very significant roles in opposition as senior health critic for the Conservative Party and in government and including cabinet. And he didn't have to do that, but he let me demonstrate my ability. And, in cabinet or in Parliament, I need 24-hour care. That includes in the Parliament of Canada on the floor, House of Commons. That includes in cabinet meetings and sub-cabinet meetings. There is always someone with me, caregiver. And these are very sensitive meetings, top secret in many cases. So there had to be a trust, not only for me, but also in my caregiver. And I give credit to my colleagues. Not once did anyone ever complain. Why is that person here? Everyone understood. And I'll make this observation, if I may, Melanie. If the Prime Minister of the country can have a quadriplegic attend the most sensitive and intense meetings that exist, perhaps, in Canada at the political level, there's no reason why that can't exist in boardrooms across the country or any other scenario. If accommodations can be made at the federal cabinet level, they can be made at any level, anywhere in society. And I think that was demonstrated. I'm very grateful that that was allowed to happen.
And you said that beautifully. And I have a follow up question to that because what you just said is very powerful. So, what do you think is holding back other areas of Canadian life from having that happen?
Well, there are systemic issues across the country, like right from infrastructure, from transportation, accessible taxis, or that is a big thing. That I have a big wheelchair, and going from being right across the country, it varies greatly from east to west, north to south. It's getting better now, but back then, at the turn of the century, it wasn't. It was pretty dire in that regard. Funding, for care, living costs. Like I live in Manitoba, I have no idea how anybody makes it in Toronto or Vancouver.
Mhm.
Those kind of
Thank you.
living.
Yes, very true.
I they so those are so housing is a big issue. Um, Opportunities in the job market, as I say, people make assumptions about individuals with disabilities and will not even consider them for positions, and that is a self-fulfilling prophecy because the fewer people you see with disabilities, the greater the it's stigmatized that people with disabilities are unable to work. When in fact, many people with disabilities are far more motivated than many other people without disabilities, I find, and are much more reliable, a lot more keen on demonstrating their ability and never take anything for granted. There's a work ethic and an appreciation for the opportunities that we have as Canadians, that all Canadians have, and people with varying abilities just want to be able to take advantage of the opportunities that are available to everyone, and at least have the opportunity to seize the chance to live full, meaningful, dignified, productive lives.
Absolutely. And I think you highlighted a lot of the barriers that people across Canada with disabilities are facing, whether it's from the housing, transportation, employment, and obviously the stigma that goes along with it. So thank you for that. Now, I know that you have been advocating for yourself and others when it comes to accessibility needs. Can you talk a little bit about what that's been like for you?
Well, and I guess accessible. Again, I'm about empowerment,
Hmm.
um, and I look at it from from an individual point of view. Like there, you could look at it from a collectivist point of view, but I figure, and this is maybe where I'm a little outside the norm in the disability community. I figure my logic is if you can ensure the rights of an individual to participate in society, that takes care of whatever group that person is a part of. So, yeah, let's get rid of the curb cuts or the sidewalks with, the 4-inch lips at the end of the
Hmm.
road. Make universal design the norm, not the exception. Accessible workplaces, transportation. It's better for everyone. It's better for the elderly. It's better for people with temporary disabilities. It's aesthetically better. It's more convenient often. And when you do that, you get more participation in society, productivity increases, and happiness is improved throughout society. And one of the tough things about Canada, one of the greatest things about Canada is our confederation. And one of the most frustrating things about Canada is our confederation. Because a lot of the issues that touch on disability are of provincial jurisdiction or even municipal. And that's a patchwork. So to strive to have the highest standard across the board, I think is the goal. And look at it from an individual perspective to allow even say the person in the worst situation that you can imagine. If they can function in society, then everyone can function in society.
Absolutely. And I think you're right. So if you are advocating for yourself, there is that ripple effect that is that, it'll impact the community that you belong to, the different groups. And so ultimately, it is so important for us to start with ourselves as leaders, as advocates.
We'll be back in just a minute. "10 years in the making, Connecting Possibilities, the story of Connect for Life" is Melanie Taddeo's newest publication about the charity she created in 2014.
I'm Melanie Taddeo, the founder of Connect for Life. Connecting Possibilities is a story of growth, leadership, and accessibility. It is the story of Connect for Life.
Available in paperback and EPUB versions globally through all major online retailers.
And is there, again, I think all, not, well, I would say all, but most of us as individuals with disabilities really depend on different devices or assistive technology that kind of makes our everyday life go a little bit smoother. Can you talk a little bit about what sort of devices and technologies you utilize and how that's impacted your leadership and advocacy as well?
Well, this is a great issue, and technology is moving so fast. When I did my MBA, so this is 1997, 98, um, I had to use a textbook um, and go page by page. There was no there weren't computer textbooks or, voice activation was at the very early stage. So it was very tedious to do that. And you had to relearn how to learn because you didn't have time to go back and read. You had to learn it basically through the first read of the material. Now, with YouTube and machine brain interfaces and voice activation and a whole myriad of other technologies, there are a lot of ways to accomplish the goal without doing it maybe in the traditional way, which we don't have to type in a computer anymore. There's lots of ways to access it. Same with a book. You don't have to turn a page. You get it audio books or in PDF form, any other myriad of other methods, and that's a game changer, and that is also an equalizer for people of any ability, and the cost is going down generally. The cost is a factor at the cutting edge stuff, but overall, it is getting to a point where you can do a lot more with a lot less upfront financial resources, which is very important.
Absolutely. Now, with all of these great, I'm going to call them game changers because really for myself as well, they have made my life. When you were talking about being in school and textbooks, I was going back in. That was after I had just lost my eyesight. I was like, oh gosh, audiobooks. But I had never had to use those before. So it was a very big change. Now it's like everyday life. So when you're thinking about how that's evolving when it comes to leadership and advocacy, what are some of the pros? What are perhaps still some of the challenges?
Well, I think some of the pros include what you do, Melanie, and that's having a podcast that can reach anywhere in the world and have this kind of discussion. And some people will probably access this podcast through closed caption or through just the text of the transcript. That's all great efficiencies. That's just on podcasts. There's YouTube videos, voice activation, this Neuralink stuff where they put sensors in people's brains to allow them to move cursors and all sorts of computer interface technology. Like that is all very empowering, and the stereotypes of what can or cannot be done are changing very rapidly. And, when I had my accident, the OT, the occupational therapist, wanted me to use a mouth stick. And I was like, I'm never going to use a mouth. And I never have. So people who were injured in the generation before me, that was very common. That was the only way they could access it. And, it's just amazing how technology makes things easier for everyone. And even day-to-day life, like online banking, do that. You can trade stocks in real time. You can do things that would have been unthinkable when I was growing. And now we have this artificial intelligence and robots, and who knows what the future will bring us. And there's
Mhm.
advances in medicine that may prevent or mitigate a lot of disabilities in the first instance. So there's hope in that regard too.
Yes, the possibilities are endless, and you're right. We don't know what the future will hold. So, with yourself, please correct me if I'm wrong. You are you in a motorized wheelchair? How do you how do you get around with mobility?
I am paralyzed from the neck down,
Hmm.
so I only have a little bit of motion in my neck. So I have a power wheelchair, and there's little sensors on either side of my head, and that allow me to turn off or the wheelchair or change mode from going forward to backward, or tilt back or recline. And I adjust the speed by how much I can push back on the headrest. And that's all I've got. And again, even in the time I've been injured, the technology on wheelchairs has changed a lot, and they're getting uh, more features and more interface with other types of computer technology. And it's things are changing quickly. Though let's also be frank here, like not the way it used to be. It's I much prefer my life as it was before my accident,
Mhm.
and um, like in just no comparison. But that also comparison isn't very helpful. You know, things happen in life. No one, it's not fair, and one has to look at what you can do to maximize the opportunities and your potential, even though that potential has changed had the accident or the disability not have occurred. But and that's a tough realization, and I think people with acquired disabilities deal with that every day, probably. What if, why, or if only. But looking back, I find done in the wrong way, a path to darkness rather than the more productive path of doing the best you can in the circumstances you find yourself. And
Mm,
society can be made in a way that allows people to do that. There shouldn't be artificial barriers that prevent people from reaching that full potential, like curb cuts or silly architecture and unfair financial barriers and so on.
definitely. We could always do the shoulda, coulda, would've situations in all of our lives, I think. And I agree. I've had many of those moments that can take you down that sad pathway, but by embracing what's possible, we change that narrative. Now, when I was doing some research prior to our conversation, I noticed that you've had the opportunity to do a lot of outdoor activities after your accident. Can you talk a little bit about what that experience has been like?
Sure. I, I took up disabled sailing, which is using a sailboat with a sip and puff technology that a guy named Sam Sullivan came up with or pioneered in Vancouver. Um, there's gizmos that allow me to go hiking. It's like a rickshaw, so I can go backcountry hiking in the Canadian Shield or in the Rockies. I go camping. Uh, Figured out how to do those types of things. I I was a geological engineer, so I have an enthusiasm for rocks and minerals, and been able to participate on mineral digs and things of that nature, and just being out of in the wilderness. That's an important, very important part of my life, and I had some of the happiest memories of my life. I've been in the wilderness as we're talking, and looking at some photos in just behind my screen here of being out canoeing for my accident, and that's really, it's nice to be able to still participate in those type of activities. Now,
Ah,
I've also been able to go from coast to coast in Canada,
mhm.
uh, from Bonavista, Vista, Vancouver Island, uh, all the way up to Alert, which is as far north as you can go in the world, and be on land. It's a tip of Ellesmere Island, um, and all over the world, uh, traveling and being able to see other cultures and other countries. And a lot of people wouldn't have thought that would be possible as well. So there are opportunities, um, and in, and for me, there's a will, there's a way. As far as I know, I think I was furthest north anyone in any quadriplegic has been, which is Alert,
Wow.
80 degrees north. Um, and I was on a government Canada exercising. It turns out to be quite topical now because all the silliness south of the border. But if Canada can have someone in a quadriplegic power wheelchair go up to the very tip of its territory in the remotest parts of the world and do that safely with his caregivers, I mean, that's a demonstration of our sovereignty. And by the way,
Mhm.
Alert, which is a Canadian Forces piece, is a lot more accessible than many places in downtown Toronto.
Amazing. Oh my gosh, that's so good to hear. And you're right, because it just shows the possibilities and the freedoms and the opportunities that Canada has to offer all of us. Now, you talked about travel. So, of course, I would be amiss not to give you the opportunity to talk about your experience with traveling as an individual who is a wheelchair user and some of the things that you've encountered. And I bring it up mainly because when I was reading the articles about what you're going through with different airlines, I really appreciated the way you presented the facts of the situation. There was an emotion tied into what you were sharing. I'm sure there's lots of emotion involved, but the way it was presented online for me to understand was very, very clear. And I thought that was beautifully done. So, can you talk a little bit about the situation, please?
So, just for context, as
Hmm.
a member of Parliament, I have traveled all across the country on all different airlines in different aircraft, and I would go from Winnipeg to Ottawa every week. So, uh, out on Sunday, back on Thursday night, and sometimes while I was in Ottawa, I'd be going to Toronto for the so lots of flying. So incredibly, uh, one of our national airlines, we'll just call it WestJet, to be clear,
Yeah.
imposed a 300-pound limit on the weight of wheelchairs that they will accept onto their aircraft. 737s and Dash 8s, two very different aircraft. same weight restriction. And I was surprised because I had been flying on WestJet for 30 years, my power wheelchair without a problem. Then all of a sudden they implemented this issue. So I raised it with WestJet and then realized really quickly that this was an intentional policy. And then with the Canadian Transportation Agency. And WestJet made the claim in their formal submission that power wheelchairs affect the airworthiness of their aircraft. That was the reason, and the only reason that they provided. Now, I know from my own experience that was nonsense. The planes haven't changed. The airports haven't changed. Power chairs haven't changed. But what WestJet, in my view, is attempting to do is to restrict power wheelchairs. People with this, most power wheelchairs are over 300 pounds from utilizing the aircraft, either forcing people to not travel or push them on to other airlines. But in Western Canada, WestJet is the main airline. And, there's cases in Saskatchewan, for example, where people have to drive to Alberta, get into access to another airline. Anyway, WestJet imposed this 300-pound limit, and they applied it to Dash 8s, which are an entirely different kind of aircraft than the Boeing aircraft. Again, claiming it was airworthiness, the issue. And this is against the law, the accessible transportation guarantees that were long fought for by the disabled community in the generation before us. And obviously, this kind of regulatory backstep can be very harmful for people with disabilities, because if all the airlines decided to do that, nobody would be able to travel. And the airlines did, and WestJet did something which I find, as a professional engineer myself, very distasteful, is they claimed airworthiness as the issue and the only issue. And this is this stigmatizes an entire group of Canadians that, in effect, that people with power wheelchairs are a safety hazard for all the other people who are traveling simply because they have a power wheelchair that weighs over 300 pounds. And through the proceedings, WestJet, despite their claims of engineering reports and so on, has not been able to produce any of these reports. And I expect the Transportation Agency will, after a year of crazy submissions going back and forth, will soon find that WestJet has implemented a policy that is not consistent with Boeing or Bombardier regulations, that they're trying to use company policy to circumvent the federal law. And I've already have letters from the Minister of Transportation Canada. By the way, I'm the former Minister of State for Transport, so I'm very well aware of these types of issues. And none of WestJet's claims have been substantiated. But if we, as an individual or Canadians, allow corporations to impose policies that are illegal and clearly stigmatize entire groups based on a fiction, that is very damaging.
Mhm.
And I hope that what WestJet is done here will not only be stopped, but will be used as an example of what corporations should and must not be allowed to do. And that's for everyone's sake.
Absolutely, because the impact that it's not just having on yourself, but people around Canada, not only the stigma, but preventing them because of whatever their reasoning, whatever the fictitious reason they've given, but there's obviously an underlying bias of some sort, but we're not going to just guess. But clearly, that is harmful to the progress that we've
Well,
made.
well I'll guess.
Okay,
I'll
go
guess
for it, please. Yes.
that the guess is that they don't want the hassle of having to take the wheelchair from the gate and put it in the cargo hold of the airplane. Other airlines do it. Every other airline major airline in North America and Europe and Australia, like any can do it, but WestJet, no. Even though so for reasons of convenience and presumably profit, they have made this fiction. They've invented this fairy tale to prevent a certain group of people from traveling WestJet. And it's abhorrent. WestJet used to be a great airline. And for whatever reason, they've done this. And they'll say, well, it's a competitive environment. Well, no, it's not actually. WestJet has a duopoly in Canada. They have guaranteed spots and are, that's why we don't have Delta Airlines or American Airlines fly from Winnipeg to Toronto. That's for Canadian carriers. And if WestJet wants to open up Canadian Airways to foreign competition, well, we can have that conversation. But until that happens, WestJet needs to follow the laws of the land. And some of those laws protect WestJet's duopoly. And there are expectations that WestJet will meet the needs of all Canadians.
And oh my goodness. So I'm going to ask, where can people learn more? Because I don't have the website right off the head, but when I did my research, I found all the information so people can read about this case and the factual information that you've shared and how they can really follow it to understand. Because I think it's important that all Canadians have the opportunity to really understand what happens behind the scenes. If it's not in the news, then it's out of people's minds. But because it has been in there, so where can people find more information?
But you can just Google Stephen Fletcher WestJet,
There you
or
go.
I have a Substack,
Mhm.
Stephen John Fletcher.substack.com, and it goes in very great detail. And I also have a website, stephenfletcher.com, Stephen with a V. And there's also LinkedIn and Facebook. This is a thin edge of the wedge situation. And I think some good Canadian common sense will be helpful to WestJet to smarten up and not to stigmatize people for no fault of their own and for no reason. It's very infuriating, actually.
Absolutely.
And I'll be taking them to the Canadian Human Rights Commission after the CTA, and I hope there will be permanent and systemic change.
And that is advocacy at its best. Stephen, you have illustrated in this conversation the importance of leadership, advocacy, but mainly from a perspective of just get it done, do what you want to do, achieve those goals just by being yourself in whatever way necessary. And the impact that you have had on Canada as the disability community, and now, of course, across Canada, for bringing awareness to everybody about what is happening. I cannot thank you enough for taking the time to sit down and speak with me, but also for sharing your insights. My last question will be, do you have any advice, anyone wanting to really make an impact, whether in leadership or advocacy? What is your one piece of advice you'd give?
Well, Melanie, first of all, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to have this discussion. And I think your example is a great one to have methods of communication that are widely and easily accessible to have these discussions. That is certainly very important. And from an individual perspective, is to get your there is some sort of emergency in Winnipeg that just
Oh, no worries. I hope everything's okay.
yes, probably the weather.
Yes.
Anyway, it's to be able to empower yourself by getting your own life in order, and then after you've done that, go the next step and pursue your dreams. And in Canada, that's possible. You have to be realistic. You're maybe not going to be on the NHL hockey team, but you could be a CEO or a welder or a leader in your community at your community club or your art group. That's all part of living life.
Absolutely. I encourage our audience to check out Stephen's information, his website, what did you call it? A stack? A stack.
Oh, yeah, it's a Substack.
Substack. Thank you. Yeah.
The latest kind of bloggy thing that they've got going. And, so it's common in the journalists or public policy circles as these Substacks.
Okay, and that's perfect. Thank you for clarifying that, because I'm thinking of Haystack. That's a digital business card. That's not what it is.
Substack, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, it's the technology. It keeps going.
That's right. There's so many.
Yeah.
But thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Until next time, and thank you again, Stephen. Have a wonderful day.
You have been listening to Connect for Life, the podcast. Connect for Life is a Canadian-based registered charity committed to eliminating barriers for people with disabilities. Visit connectforlife.ca and join us in helping people with disabilities become the champions of their growth stories.